Plus 1 second increment. Danya, you said that Hikaru claimed that's his best time control. He's proven it right now.
He is, and he might not be in perfect form. He might have converted that, a little bit faster 5 years ago, but it doesn't matter. He's doing enough things right to put the kind of pressure that he needs on Hans's position and Hans's clock, and this lead back to its largest of the match. This is a pivotal game for Hans, who switches up his opening and pushes the queen's pawn instead. Maybe a little Beth Harmon is what he needs.
Well, we do have not a Queen's Gambit accepted, but a Queen's Gambit declined. And we have a solid pawn structure for black. You look on the queen side, it's a pawn chain. A pawn's best friend is another pawn. But white is going right after the b7 pawn. Danya, these types of moves, rook a7, they're ugly, I think, especially for players who aren't so experienced. Like, what in the world is that? But it's solid. It's hard to actually break through here for white.
I'm going to rewind for just a second and show an important line, because the position, pretty solid. Not much is going to happen in the next couple moves. But after rook a7, what this hinges on, as we bring up an analysis board here, is that after the bishop trade on d6, white tries queen b6, hitting the rook. Looks like black is losing the pawn, but there's a beautiful retreating move, knight to c8, forcing this queen back. Just look at this arrangement of pieces. This is the tactical justification. Let's run through the current moves really quickly. Black completing the development. Hans playing the typical move b4 and a4, preparing b5, and he's just carrying out the textbook plan. Hikaru, what's he doing?
Well, maybe he wants b5, knight d6, knight c4 type of ideas, but is he in time? That's always an essential question, because if white takes on b5, you're first to the a file. That looks very pleasant, but that might be the way to go, because otherwise white simply pushes the b pawn, and we see it here. It's a pawn minority attack against a Carlsbad structure. But Danya, a5 played by Hikaru, so he's keeping more pawns on the queen side, and that queen on b2, not the best placed piece, and after knight takes g6, white can get access to the b1 square, which is really important.
But I'm surprised that Hans didn't play this, the straightforward way. B takes c6, get a long-term weakness on c6, and that knight on h4, it just exchanged itself for the bishop. Very tempting, but it also could have involved itself in the direct attack on the c6 pawn. Feels like Hans might have missed a moment to make the most of his advantage, but it still seems like he's in the driver's seat. Hikaru recaptures with the rook, going for piece activity over the health of his pawn structure. Feels like he needs to change the course of this game, and that's what he might be doing. Is he going to jump to c4?
That's the move I would.
Rook c8, knight a7 is a fork to watch.
Knight e4, there's rook f6 ideas, queen f5 as well. The f2 pawn could be tender in some positions. And, well, now he's fighting for the c file, rook c8 next. So I feel like Hikaru's doing everything he needs to do to stay in this game. He is worse on the queen side despite being a pawn ahead there, right? The b7 pawn is extra, but it's also backwards. And on the other hand, white, where are you going to push forward from? That's not an easy question to answer.
I wouldn't rule out g5 and rook h6, taking a page of Ali Reza's book. We saw him doing that with the white pieces yesterday, but Hikaru's definitely looking at the king side. I'm not saying g5 leads to checkmate, but Hans should not ignore the fact that there are no pieces surrounding his king, and he doesn't, right? He wants to make sure there are no pieces surrounding anything, and that there are no pieces at all.
Look at that juicy outpost on b4. That's a dark square. White has a light square bishop. So if the knights get traded, right, the white knight is gone, and a knight lands on b4, done. You cannot kick it out of that square.
Yeah, Hans needs to do something before that happens. Maybe he needs to take on e4 before the knight gets to b4, and then play the move rook to c1. Who benefits if the rooks get traded? That's a hard strategic question as the time situation equalizes. And I think Hikaru, he's just done an excellent job of pounding white's initiative, getting his pieces active. I guess we'll get an answer to that question pretty momentarily.
This exact sequence has happened, and white has the best pawn on the board, right? The d4 pawn is a protected pass pawn, but it can't move forward. The knight on b4 is really powerful there, and then knight may land on d3. So white does need to be careful that king can get in some danger. It may seem safe. There's only one black queen in the mix, but for example, if that knight could go to f6 and then g4, the queen can infiltrate on the h-file or on the first rank. So Hans does need to be careful right now.
And he can take on a5, but there's an important perpetual that you should keep track of here. Queen d1 and queen h5, right? The h-file, you called it, looks insignificant with no rooks on the board, but the queen and the knight are a fearsome attacking tandem, and sometimes all you need is a queen to force the draw. Now, b6 might run into queen to c2.
I'm thinking queen d7 here, Don. Yeah, he gives
it. So is Hikaru.
What do you make of this? And I think Hans answered the question that he didn't want to have a pawn race where he's got central pawns for outside pawns. But, Danya, that's, I think, a clear little win for Hikaru because Hans just went back and forth.
And now, again, with that 3-point lead, Hikaru was back to playing kind of manager risk chess. And Hans is the one who has to refrain from repeating, which is pretty risky. He is up 3. 30 seconds on the clock as he gets his queen to a nice multi-purpose square. It guards d1. It controls the c file. What's on the c file? Nothing. We might see a kind of Soviet schoolboy move from Hikaru. The queen's kind of jockeying for position here. It's the calm before the storm, or at least it feels that way.
The a4 pawn, though, you need to look out for that. Knight b6 at some moment could be annoying with queen c6 to follow. These kind of ideas where if you can keep attacking the a4 pawn, you're protecting the there it is. You could take on e4, but you drop a4, and that looks scary for white because the a5 pawn, that could be a huge asset.
So maybe queen c3 is what's required. Trade the a pawn for the a pawn. But then black gets a pass b pawn. That knight can jump to b2 and back around at an outpost that you mentioned. And so nice that black's king has this lovely, very safe, protected square on h7, waiting for it in the event of a back rank check.
And Hans has been up on time, but suddenly we're getting closer to clock equality, although now Hikaru's in for a big think, and he trades the queen. So Don, in endgames, we typically like outermost pawns, but as you're pointing out, the knight coming to d6, the black knight can come to c3, but a5 will drop if that's the case.
That's exactly right. Maybe Hikaru, it's a very audacious move. He might want to sack the e-pawn at the right moment, break through with b5, and run his a-pawn down the board. That's a lot of pawns to give up, and even if white gives up the knight for black's a-pawn, that pawn avalanche as a result might be overwhelming.
Wow.
F5 by Hikaru. He wants knight c3 next.
And the knight can't get back around to protect the a4 pawn. So they don't know the evaluation. You all do, and so do we. But look at this. It's equal, but it's actually not that clear. The black king is sprinting to the center. Does white push the d pawn? No, it keeps it in place, and suddenly white's winning.
His white's pawns are going to mobilize. King to d5. White's going to go f3 and e4, and it's black's pawns that are further advanced. But look at this knight paralyzing them. You can't go b5. Here come white's pawns, pushing the king around like a plaything. And a g4 by Hans. Very patient. He's going to go e5 or d5 very shortly, right now.
But he might need to pick correctly, because sometimes you play e5 and the black king gets right back into the d5 square. But he can't play d5, but then the black knight gets back to c5.
So he plays neither.
Yeah, he brings his king back around. That knight is trapped. So Hikaru gives up a5, and he's hoping that he can just go after the white pawns, but I think with those double G pawns for both sides, I mean, that's one of the ugliest pawn structures you can see.
Oh my gosh.
In complete control here.
And finally, Hikaru gets one of his pawns moving. That knight is just jumping around. It has had way too much coffee. And is it finally time to push d5? No.
He goes back because, king d3, so you're giving up the g3 pawn, but the knight's trapped there. King e3 to f3.
Oh my gosh. And Hikaru might have to give up his second pawn to extricate that poor knight.
It's not getting out.
It's still not going to get out. Knight f1, king e2, knight h2. I think he should try b3. But you can just, oh my gosh.
He wants to trade off all the pawns.
Great try. I've drawn so many of these positions. You don't know which pawn to stop with which piece, and you end up losing your only pawn.
And I'm looking at Hans here.
Oh my lands.
Oh, here's the g pawn.
And this is typical Hikaru. He's going to go g3. White's pieces are going to be tied down to stopping these passers. b3.
Oh, my
Black's
goodness.
king sliding in. It's a draw.
It's like a split in bowling, right? You just can't get them all. The knight goes to g3. The king goes back to d5. And
Oh, he blundered. Oh, no. Is it a win?
Oh, look
How
at
do
it.
you win?
Look at his face. He's really upset.
Oh, g1 queen.
G1 equals queen.
Oh, my gosh.
Hans blunders it right back, and he slaps his forehead. That game is a draw. Hikaru, he is